In light of recent events in Paris, which has led to the unfortunate death of 10 journalists, once again, Muslims find themselves at the centre of attention regarding the whole freedom of speech debate and whether Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, should be satirised. Before we look into how Islam promotes and advocates open dialogue at all levels of society, let's briefly look into the origins of the concept of freedom of speech.
Free speech arose in Europe as a response to arbitrary rule, as a response to restrictions on human intellectual development and the pursuit of truth. Free speech was used as a utility for something else, and it wasn't for its own sake, and it was used as a utility to achieve truth and to account injustice or what was wrong, and for the improvement of mankind. It was never envisioned by the early liberal founding fathers that free speech would be used for anything except those things. They certainly didn't countenance use of free speech for gratuitous insult or to insult social mores, which are fundamental to keeping stability in that society. In fact, many of them always gave caveats for that the sovereign can impose limits to prevent social disorder. So it was never really envisioned free speech to be open and gratuitous, but rather it had a purpose, and its purpose was the pursuit of truth and accountability.
It's clear that the main objectives of freedom of speech was to establish justice, accountability and human progression. Are those objectives still the same today, or is it applied with double standards?
Clearly there are double standards in free speech. You can see, for example, in the case of Nicolas Sarkozy in France, where he sought the prosecution of people for writing lyrics and raps against him. You can see in Denmark, where the publication of cartoons was prevented because they were in relation to the Jewish community. So there are evidently double standards.
Now that we've understood that absolute free speech does not exist, and speech in itself is restricted by specific laws which are influenced by the dominant moral ethics of a society, how does Islam promote dialogue and debate? Does it recognize free speech? If so, how is it manifested, and can it be applied today?
The Islamic view on speech is very coherent. Yes, it allows you to express yourself intellectually, have dialogue and debate. The Qur'an says, debate in ways that are better. Use good speech. God doesn't love the utterance of evil speech. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon whom be peace, said that we must have good manners, that we should speak good or remain silent. And I want to make it very clear that the Islamic intellectual and spiritual tradition almost forces us from that perspective to engage in dialogue and debate and in intellectual activity, even if we're discussing with others who we know that their views are abhorrent to us. We can't curse them. It must be couched in human language, because freedom of speech is not an end, it's a means. It's a means to truth, justice and accountability.
Free speech is something that, although we're told in the West, is boundless, limitless. In fact, every society, including our own here, has limits on it. It has limits on incitement to hatred and so forth. And so defaming somebody, being libelous towards somebody, these are all crimes, in fact, for which you can be prosecuted. In the same way, free speech surely cannot be the freedom to insult.
How did freedom of speech become the right to offend or the freedom to insult? And what does that mean for the basic interaction between humans?
Imagine Stephen Hawking, one of the most famous scientists, wanted to deliver a presentation on string theory in physics. It was a landmark presentation. It was an amazing project, amazing discoveries in quantum theory or whatever they talk about, right? And in his presentation, he starts off by cursing our mothers. Is that going to facilitate truth and human progress? Imagine, for example, political activists wanted to take to account dictators and they started by saying, hey, your mother is so-and-so, and cursed the mother of the dictator. Is that going to facilitate accountability? Imagine going to a court of law and the jury and the judge, they start degrading each other and swearing at each other. Is that going to facilitate justice? Do you see something here? Freedom to insult, freedom to degrade, freedom to dishonor goes against the very objectives of freedom of speech. And this is the point. Muslims are not shy concerning dialogue and debate. The Qur'an tells us to have debates.
The Qur'an says very clearly, O people of the Ya Ahl al-Kitab, ta'alaw ila kalimatin sawa'in baynana wa baynakum. Come to a word that is equal between us and you. Using this terminology, you can see clearly that it's an open invitation to dialogue and to a common word, a common ground, a common denominator.
Even Professor Rosalind Gwynn, she says that the reason that the Islamic scholars had intellectual engagement is because they were encouraged by the Qur'an. But what we say is this: just be human. Because a civilized society isn't a society that basically degrades each other and defames and dishonors and uses vile speech. We're human beings, so let's be human beings.
If that's how Islam has historically approached rational debate and open dialogue, why should it be any different today? Perhaps this is the best way to approach the situation regarding the caricatures of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. One such campaign that we should support is the Islamic Education and Research Academy's new campaign, Don't Hate, Debate, which invites Muslims and non-Muslims, people of faith and no faith, to have an open dialogue on a shared platform.